Today, my guest is author Jason Kersten. We will be talking about his new nonfiction book from Gotham Books Publishing, The Art of Making Money, the story of a master counterfeiter. Now, Jason is an author, journalist, and feature writer for, among others, Rolling Stone, Men's Journal, and Maxim. His first book, Journal of the Dead, was selected by the New York Times as Notable Book of 2003. Well, Jason, welcome to the show. Happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me on, Jacqueline.
I'll tell you, this book is really terrific. It's an amazing, amazing story. Your book, as we said, The Art of Making Money, the story of a master counterfeiter. It's a terrific story. You first wrote it for Rolling Stone magazine, where it appeared in July 2005. Tell our audience who the story is about and how you found him.
Well, the story is about Art Williams, who is a master counterfeiter, most famous for doing an almost perfect replica of the 1996 new note back in 96 when the money changed for the first time in about 60 years. And that was a really hard bill to counterfeit, and he just did a magnificent job of replicating all these features of the bill. And he actually found me. This was through a Hollywood producer who met him in Chicago. Art was on parole at the time, and he was driving this producer around because they had a common friend. And of course, he sees this Hollywood producer and says, "Oh, you should tell my story. I have a great story." And he, the producer, his name is Paul Pompey, and he hears this from everybody. So he kind of blew Art off. And then the last day he was there, he said, "All right, kid, before we go to the airport, I'll take you out to lunch. You can tell me your story." And when Paul heard Art's story, he was absolutely blown away. And being from Chicago himself, a lot of the world and the characters that Art was describing struck Paul as very authentic. And Paul decided, well, maybe there's a book in this, not just a movie. And he actually contacted my agent. And, of course, when I hear a criminal wants a book written about him, I just kind of roll my eyes. I said, well, let me talk to him. Maybe I'll do a magazine story if he checks out. And, of course, Art did check out. And his story was incredible. And through the process of writing the magazine story, I realized, there's a much bigger story here. I want to write a book about this guy.
Now, what year was this where you were first put together? Because the article...
Been in early, I think February 2005 is when I first met him in Chicago.
All right, so then it wasn't long after that, because it was July 2005 when it appeared in the magazine.
Right.
So you got through that really fast, but his story is incredible. Now, what was it? Was it just the story itself, or was it Art Williams that got you interested enough after you wrote the article in Rolling Stone magazine to say to yourself, I want to write a book about this guy?
Well, the first thing that initially drew me in was counterfeiting, which is very much of a dying art. These days, a lot of counterfeiters, just use inkjet printers and computer technology, unlike the old days where guys had an offset press and inky fingers, and they were criminal craftsmen, really. So that the crime itself I found fascinating, but when it was really getting to know Art and hearing the story of his childhood and his family and how his father abandoned him and growing up in the projects in Chicago, and just this, and what a gifted little kid he was, skipping 2 grades, and then before everything in his family fell apart, that really became the prime drive for me.
Yeah,
with his personal story.
Yeah, you make reference, or your publicist, someone makes reference, I think you were quoted on it, that this is not just a story about counterfeiting, it's a story of a man's search. You call it a quest for his father, and the tragedies that ensued. What led you to use that term? The quest, you kind of think of, somebody running after windmills. Did you see the comparison there?
Yeah, art? That's not a bad analogy.
Yeah, that's what I saw when I read it.
Yeah, I thought that was something added to the story, or it's really at the heart of it, that a lot of readers can relate to. Art comes from a very different world than most of us, but his personal drives are the same as all of ours. And this need to, his father, for your listeners, his father abandoned the family when Art was about 10, and Art never heard from him again. And he always wondered for many, many years what had happened to his dad. And I thought that was, in some ways, his counterfeiting, even when his dad wasn't around, was to impress his father, to fill this void that had been left. It wasn't about the money. And that was just absolutely fascinating to me. That it really wasn't about the money.
Well, he sure comes across as a very charismatic guy. He was hard, he was tough. But if you didn't know his background or what he was involved in, I think he'd be a very likable person. And, and also we hear a lot about Chicago, obviously, because that's where our president is from, and we heard a lot about Chicago before that. But in your book, you paint a really great picture of the Chicago neighborhood in which he grew up. It was a tough neighborhood. Can you describe the neighborhood a little bit and what it must have been like, what his surroundings were like growing up?
Sure. Art comes from he grew up in the Chicago neighborhood of Bridgeport, which is Chicago's oldest slum. It was originally an Irish slum. From the Irish came there and they built the canal. And this place has a long storied history. It's been full of gangs throughout almost all of its history. And it's almost like a little Yugoslavia where each block has a different gang. And the gangs there are fascinating because they're not necessarily ethnically uniform. You might have white kids and Mexican kids and Italian kids all in the same gang.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much of a fight for your meat kind of neighborhood. One of Chicago's toughest neighborhood. So it's a tough neighborhood and a tough town. I remember driving through the neighborhood with Art, as he was showing me around or walking through the neighborhood, and on every block you'd sort of see these little groups of kids, and they'd just stare at you like, "Who are you?
Right.
What are you doing on my street?" And then they'd see Art, and of course they'd know I was okay. But there's almost something feral going on. Art grew up in the only white projects in Chicago, the Bridgeport homes, and this was a tough place.
But originally it was all Irish, you said, is that right?
Yeah, it was all Irish,
and
then,
art is
Lithuanians
Irish.
came in, and all kinds of other mixes, too.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I failed to mention, what part of the country are you in, Jason?
I live in Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn. Okay, so we're talking to you from Brooklyn, or are you on tour now?
I'm done with the tour now,
okay.
So I'm back home in Brooklyn.
Good. Okay, very good. Well, tell us a little more about what Art Williams' early life was like after his dad left. He's 10 years old, and here he is, no father. He had his mother and a sister, is that correct?
Yeah, and also a little brother.
The little brother? Okay. So what were things like for him during that period? Tell us a little bit about his mother.
Well, his mom, Melinda, she was diagnosed bipolar when she was still with Art's dad. And shortly after he left, they wound up in the Bridgeport homes, like I said before. And there was an incident where his mom got in a fight with his aunt. His aunt hit his mother over the head with a beer bottle.
Ooh.
And she was hospitalized. The kids had to, go into child services for a few months as she recovered. But when she was recovered, her bipolar had altered into schizophrenia, which is not an uncommon thing to happen if someone suffers a head injury. So she was bipolar schizophrenic and pretty much, would be incapacitated at certain times, talking to leprechauns at one point Art had witnessed her doing. And so the mother was unable to really take care of the family financially. And so when he was about 12, the first crime that Art ever committed had been robbing from parking meters after there had been no food in the house for 2 days. The kids were crying, the mom was crying. He didn't want to go to the church or social services because they were afraid they were just going to take his mother away, which had happened before. So he goes out onto the street and he just starts hitting these parking meters on Halstead, and he hears the change inside, and he thinks, if I could only get at that change. And so he actually takes a piece of wire and makes a little key that opens up these two holes.
My goodness.
And he comes back with about $50 worth of groceries.
And he's 12.
He's 12. and that really set the stage for the criminality that would develop later when, he's stealing cars, stealing things from cars. And, I should say before that, he had skipped 2 grades in school. He was a smart little kid. But once they wound up in the projects and money was, never around, he started realizing that, school wasn't doing much for him. He also wound up in one of the worst schools in Chicago. And so the gang there on the projects really became his new family. They helped show him how to survive through crime.
Isn't that something? Now, what happened next? A man comes into his life, and I believe that's when he started counterfeiting. Why don't you tell us that? When did he start counterfeiting, and how did he learn it? And who did he learn it from? He started
counterfeiting at the age of 16, and he learned from his mother's boyfriend, a man he gave the street name Da Vinci. He won't tell me his real name, but he was a guy in the neighborhood that Art's seen around. Art's mom worked at a diner across the street from the projects, and this guy would come in, and he treated her very nice. And Art liked him, and, well, this guy sees that Art's getting into trouble on the streets more frequently, and he's dropped out of school, and he says, you know what, kid, if you're interested, I can show you a real crime, one that'll keep you off the streets. And, so he takes Art to his print shop, his secret printing hole, and he teaches Art the criminal craft of counterfeiting, using the old offset method with offset press and making plates, shooting negatives, mixing inks. And so Art really learns from this guy from the ground up. He becomes his apprentice.
When I read that part in the book about Da Vinci teaching him, it made me wonder what it was about Art that this guy trusted so much, because certainly he kept it quiet from other people what he was doing, but there must have been something in Art that he felt he could trust him. Did Art ever speak about that relationship?
The trust relationship, he didn't really address that precisely, but I think what he saw in Art was that Art had been getting in trouble for numerous things when he was a kid, and he had seen Art going in and out of juvenile hall for auto theft, things like that. One of the things about Art is Art never told on anyone. He had a code, and he would kept it his whole life. And that was in the Bridgeport code. The rat is the absolute worst thing in the world, and I'm sure that Da Vinci had picked up from just the way Art spoke that he had a street honor.
Well, and like you said, he was creative, so that probably also appealed to Da Vinci. For those of my audience that have just tuned in, I'm talking to Jason Kersten about his new book, The Art of Making Money, The Story of a Master Counterfeiter. Again, it's quite a book. On your book tour, what's your audience reaction been to the book?
Oh, it's been very positive. People love it. The saddest thing is, I wish Art hadn't gone back to prison because, I always wanted people to meet him because, he's really fun to talk to.
Well,
but,
and
the reaction's been fantastic.
Yeah, well, it should be. I mean, it's quite it's quite a story, and we will talk a little bit more about what happened to Art, and so let's see. Now, the next thing that happens is that by the 80s, copying equipment enabled counterfeiters to easily copy money. Jason, I had started to ask you about the 1980s when the copy equipment that was available then allowed counterfeiters to easily copy the money. And by 85, they were so good that the Treasury Department issued 2 reports and instituted some minor changes in the 1990s. But that failed. Can you describe a little bit the changes that they made in the early 90s and why they failed?
Yeah, well, the number one change they made was they introduced something called the security strip. And if you hold, any bill except a 1, in front of a light source, you can see that strip inside the bill. It's a polymer strip. It'll also glow different colors according to what denomination it is. The reason they put that in is when you put a bill in a copy machine, and the light comes on under it, your copy will show that strip on the copy. But of course, it's something you can't actually see unless in an actual bill unless you hold it up to the light. So this was meant to foil the photocopiers, and
but that didn't work.
It didn't really work because nobody really looked for the strip to begin with. It's almost like they didn't advertise it enough. And so nobody, if nobody's looking at it, nobody really cares. It has had a long-term positive effect against those color copiers. But what the counterfeiters would just do is they just counterfeit, the older notes that didn't have the strip.
Now, during this time, was Art continuing the counterfeiting? Was he still doing that, or did he get into some other things? Because then he has a girlfriend, or did he get married first and then end up with a girlfriend?
No,
he never got married.
They never got married.
Yeah, so it was his girlfriend, and by 1990, she had a baby. And how did that change Art?
Well, I mean, that's right about the same time that he's learning to counterfeit with Vinci, and that was another incentive to learn this craft, criminal craft, was so we could try to support his family, and he lacked the maturity after Vinci left his mom, and Vinci just kind of disappeared. After he left, Art really lacked the maturity to counterfeit on his own. But a few years later, he picked it back up again and started his first operation. This was about 3 years after he had learned, and he was really using that money to support his family and put him up in a nice apartment, have a nice car, nice things.
And he was still supporting his mother, wasn't he? And sister and little baby brother, were they all still around when Art's girlfriend had this baby, or had they all taken off somewhere?
Well, his little brother was in a boys' home outside of Chicago because his little brother got into a lot of trouble at school when he was little. And so he was sort of out of the picture. His mom and sister were still there, though. And yes, Art has always sort of been the breadwinner in his family.
So by this time, he hasn't seen or heard from his dad. He doesn't know where he is. And now this man that has taught him counterfeiting Vinci, he just disappears. But Art did stay clean for a while. But then what happened that was a really major thing?
Well, he got into some relationship trouble. That was pretty much self-created. Art was very, very much of a jealous type, and his girlfriend and mother of his son had always wanted to be a police officer since she was a little girl. And so suddenly, after they have the baby and the baby's getting a little older, she decides, she wants to pursue this more. And suddenly, all her friends are cops, and Art here he is, a counterfeiter going to Chicago police officer barbecues and things like that, and he starts getting a little intimidated by this. And one of the cops that his wife is friends with, gives her a job for his security company, and Art gets very jealous and immediately thinks something's going on. In fact, nothing was going on. But Art became so paranoid that they ended up fighting, and she left him, and then she did end up getting together with the guy. So it was self-creating prophecy, fulfilling prophecy there. And Art kind of has a nervous breakdown. He goes down to Texas, where his mother is now living, and he stays crime free for about a year. But eventually, he sort of winds up with this group of girls, and one of them has a boyfriend who's a drug dealer. And one of Art's favorite crimes before he was a counterfeiter was to rob drug dealers. And so he can't resist, and he finds out where this guy lives, and then he robs him. And that gets him going back into crime.
And that did him in, because then he's sentenced to 6 years for a robbery in Texas.
Yeah,
so
he gets. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's move to the next point, because he's in jail, and because I want to get to the new $100 bill. He gets out of jail, and how much time? I think he was in jail for, I don't know, several months, and he gets out of jail, and his girlfriend picks him up, and he was shocked to see the 1996 new $100 bill. Now, can you describe briefly what they finally did then to make this, quote, counterfeit proof, unquote?
Sure. Well, what they did is they completely redesigned the currency, starting with that $100 bill, the 1996 new note. The Big Head Ben was the nickname for it, because if everybody remembers, that's when suddenly the portrait on the bill, we went from these small images to these big ones that had much more fine lines in them, which were much harder to duplicate with scanners and copiers. It also had color-shifting ink on the denomination mark, where depending on the angle you looked at it, it would be go from black to green, and that was space-age technology, the same stuff that same kind of technology that coats the windows of the space shuttle.
Well, yes, it was
also had a watermark inside where you hold it up to the light and you see that smoky image. And the $100 bill still has all of this. It's pretty much the same $100 bill that you can get at the bank right now. They haven't redesigned that one much. They've redesigned everything else. But at the time, it was the most secure bill ever made. And having counterfeited before in the past, Art was immediately saw it as a challenge that whoever could do a convincing counterfeit of this stood to make a lot of money.
And we won't describe how he did it, because I'll tell you, I just sat there shaking my head as I read what he learned and how he did it. Over time, how much fake money did he make?
Well, he never kept a ledger with all his print runs in it. That would have been very incriminating.
Yeah, but he gave a guess to you as to what he thought he'd done.
He estimated that he's printed about $10 million dollars worth, and you got to remember that a lot of that, some of that he burned, because Art was very particular. If there was just something that didn't feel right about the bill, he would burn a batch of $100,000, like it was nothing. And also, professional counterfeiters like him, they sell their money most of the time. They sell it to criminal organizations for 30 or 40 cents on the dollar. So it's not 100% return. And so he sold a lot of the money, and then, of course, he started spending his own product, passing it, which Da Vinci had warned him never to do.
Yeah. Now, how long did it take him before he figured out how to counterfeit it and to make a passable one? Do you recall what the frame was?
Yeah, well, the way I'd ask him that question, and he'd say, "Oh, years! It took me years," because over years he was always improving the bills.
Right.
But to get his core replica going, it took him about 4 months of dedicated research and work. Once he got the paper and came up with his system to get the watermark in there, then he was really rolling.
And his biggest problem at that point, because he did, as you say, kept improving it and made it better and better, but his biggest problem was in passing it. And I guess he had a couple of situations, didn't he, that he tried out in terms of selling the money and got him into a few scrapes. And is that why he then decided to do it himself and his family and that kind of thing? What led him to that decision?
Well, there were a number of things that led him to start spending his own product. For one thing, he fell in love with his own bill, and he always wanted. As he said, "I like spending my money more than spending real money because it was mine and I made it." And so, and another thing, his bills were so good they passed every test. You could put the anti-counterfeiting pen on the bill, and it would mark perfectly yellow. It would come back as genuine. You could hold it up to the light. You'd see the watermark. It had the color-shifting ink. Just everything. And so that built an overconfidence in art where he just thought, man, I can just spend these things. But, the way he started doing that was after he'd do a big deal in Chicago, with the Chinese or Russian mafias or the Mexicans, he liked to split town because when his bills hit the streets, he didn't want to be around. So what he'd do is he'd print up $100,000 or $200,000, he'd sell it, and then he'd also print extra for himself, and then he'd hit the road with his girlfriend or friends, and they'd go on these long road trips, sometimes for months. And the interesting thing about his bill is it was very much portable. He could assemble it anywhere as long as he had all the different elements made. So he could actually go into a hotel room, print out, take all these elements out of boxes, and then put the bills together, then hit a strip mall the next day, and buying items worth $10 with a $100 bill, getting $90 in real money back. In a day, he could have $5,000 in genuine currency. And he'd just spend the rest of the week, river rafting, hiking, doing whatever he wanted.
And then he decided that it was about time that he goes in search of his father.
Yeah, well, he got busted.
Right.
He got busted for counterfeiting, really accidentally. I don't want to give away the
No, we
whole
don't.
story, but it
No,
was
we
in the House
don't.
of Blues Hotel in Chicago. And he beat the charge on technicality, but the Secret Service knew who he was at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And they had been looking for him for a couple years. And so he decides he's got to hit the road, and he goes down to Texas, and he has a little bit of a breakdown because of all the heat on him. And that's when he decides, I want to find my dad, and I want to go see him.
And we won't give that part away because that's a very important part of the book. So why don't you tell our audience where Art is now?
Art is in the Federal Correctional Institution in Big Spring, Texas.
Yes, he is.
I actually spoke with him this morning.
Did you really?
Yeah, he gave me a call.
Isn't that something? So he likes keeping in touch with you.
Oh, yeah.
That's great. When is he going to get out?
His release date is scheduled to be 2015, I think January of 2015. But with good behavior, which he always has, he could be out by mid-2013.
Now, his girlfriend didn't go to jail, though, right?
No.
I wondered about that.
Yeah, well, again, it goes back to kind of to Art's street code.
Mm-hmm.
The times where Art has been caught, he tends to take the rap for everyone.
Quite a guy.
Yeah, a stand-up guy, as they say.
Yeah, I'll say. So the girlfriend is still on scene, right? She's still waiting for him?
Yeah, well, they're married. They're married now.
Oh, they are?
There's rumors of a divorce. But,
yeah,
yeah.
It's always the way, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what I want my audience to know is that you have sold the movie rights for this fantastic story. How far along is that process?
Well, yeah, it's at Paramount, and there is a screenplay, and I think they're looking for a director right now.
Anyone been discussed with you as to who's going to play the part of Art? As Art, I bet Art is wondering who's going to play him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Hollywood will very often buy the rights to make a movie out of a book and then never do anything
That's
with it.
right.
So, I think we're a little early, but at various time, I've heard the names of, 4 or 5 different male stars, and
could you mention
one
a
week
couple
one
of
of them's interested, and then a week later, you're asking like people like Shia LaBeouf. I've heard was interested, and a few other guys, but it just passes. A week later, you never hear anything.
Oh,
again.
it does. I know, but I hope it comes together for a movie because it would be a great movie, and Shia LaBeouf I think would be really good for that part. He'd have to muscle up a little bit, I think. But are you involved at all? You're not involved in the screenwriting aspect of it?
No. Once they buy it from you, they tend to just want to do things their own way.
And very quickly, are you working on another project now?
Yeah, I've got a couple different projects, stewing.
Okay.
Don't really want to say anything about them.
No, we don't. We don't want you to say anything about them. But say hello to Art for me. Tell him I enjoyed his story, and it's just a great story. Stay in touch with him. We are out of time. Thanks so much for being with us. I hope you'll come back with your next book.
Anytime, Jacqueline.